Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William Wang. I'm the chair of this session. First, I'm happy to take this chance to introduce my company, Xinhua Company of South Korea, and Wenzhou Holding of China. Wenzhou Holding produces variety of salt and also have the largest sales network in China. We focus on producing healthy salt to China. I'm willing to hear different opinions about salt and health, from which I'm sure we all want to give our consumers better salt. And today, I also want to introduce Xinhua Company from South Korea. Xinhua is the only company that specializes in research and development, production, and sales of eco-friendly de-icer in Korea. The de-icer include chlorine salt type, non-chlorine salt type, and mixed solid and liquid types. The product obtained ISO certifications, and the Korean government issued environmental certification and green product certification. The products are used by the Korea Presidential Office, Army units, Air Force units, road companies, and apartment complex. I am confident about the quality and the price. Wenzhou Holding is a shareholder of Xinhua. We also run an office in Canada. And we also are looking for the agents in North America. We promise to give the best policy to our agents. Also, we do OEM. OEM is original equipment manufacturer. Welcome to visit our booth on the first floor. The president of Xinhua, Dr. Nam, will meet with you and answer your any questions. And again, welcome everyone. Let's begin our technical session. Very welcome the first speaker, Mr. Andrew Menti from McMaster University. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. So today I'll present on dietary sodium consumption and cardiovascular disease and mortality and the state of the current evidence, focusing largely on our work with the PURE study, and I'll cover some of the other literature as well. Now, I have no disclosures. I have received no honorarium for my participation at this meeting. And PHRI, the Population Health Research Institute, is covering the full costs of my participation. Now, sodium has long been considered a holy grail nutrient for reducing cardiovascular disease in populations. And this has stemmed largely from the salt hypothesis, which states that salt or sodium intake leads to raised blood pressure. And we know that higher blood pressure is a risk factor for having a heart attack, stroke, or death. And so therefore, if we reduce salt intake in the population, we'll also reduce heart attacks, stroke, and mortality in the population as well. Now, of course, this assumes that sodium affects only blood pressure and has no other effects on any other biological systems in the body. But as it turns out, that's not quite the case. Now, what are the current recommendations? Well, the WHO and other guidelines like the American Heart Association recommend that people consume anywhere between less than 2 to 2.4 grams of sodium per day, which is equivalent to about 5 to 6 grams of table salt, or about 1 teaspoon of table salt per day. That's a very low amount of salt, difficult for most people to consume even in the short term, let alone sustain in the long term. And for high-risk candidates, some guidelines recommend even lower amounts, only 1.5 grams of sodium per day, which is equivalent to only 0.7 teaspoons of table salt. Very low amount of salt. Now, achieving these targets requires substantial changes to the diet for most people. Now, first we'll look at the evidence on sodium versus blood pressure, first focusing on the observational studies. By far the most widely quoted study in the literature has been the InterSalt study, published in a British medical journal in 1988. This was a global study of over 10,000 people in 52 centers around the world. And what they found was that there's a rather weak relationship between sodium and blood pressure, with about a 1 millimeter mercury increase in systolic pressure per 1 gram increase in sodium after adjusting for random measurement error. And when you exclude 4 outlier hunter and gatherer societies that had virtually no sodium intake, there was no relationship at all between sodium and blood pressure. Now, in the same issue of the British Medical Journal as InterSalt, the Scottish Heart Study was published, an equally well-conducted study of about 7,000 people. And this study showed no relationship between sodium and blood pressure. And more recently, in the InterMap study published just this year in the journal Hypertension, over 4,800 people in 17 centers in 4 countries, again, there was no relationship between sodium and blood pressure. So in these studies of free-living populations, using 24-hour urine collections, there's at best a modest association between sodium and blood pressure, and in some studies you can see there is no association. Now, this is data presented last year at the experimental biology meeting in Chicago. This is data from the Framingham Offspring study. The blue line shows people consuming low sodium intake. The red and green is people consuming moderate and high sodium. You can see that at baseline and over a 16-year follow-up period, the low sodium group had higher blood pressure than the people in the moderate and high sodium group. So it's an inverse association. So, in free-living populations, we find that at best there's a modest association, but oftentimes, in fact, more often the case, we see no association and sometimes even an inverse association between sodium and blood pressure. Now, the DASH sodium trial has been the primary basis for current American Heart Association guidelines and USDA guidelines for reducing sodium intake in populations. It's important to note that DASH was a proof of concept study to see whether multiple changes in the diet, including sodium, would result in lower blood pressure under controlled situations, in that the food was provided to participants over a 30-day period. So it was only designed to look at short-term effects on blood pressure in a very select population that was largely salt-sensitive, pre-hypertensives and non-hypertensives, and largely emphasizing African Americans and hypertensive individuals. So it wasn't a random sample of people from the general population representing normal-tensives as well. So importantly, it was not designed to assess if sodium reduction also reduces cardiovascular disease and mortality in free-living populations. So that brings us to large population studies for looking at relationships between sodium and clinical events. To study clinical events in large groups of people, we have to be able to measure sodium intake practically in large numbers of people. And 24-hour urines are not feasible for large-scale studies. And under collection is also a problem for 24-hour urinary collections. Fasting morning urines have been used to estimate 24-hour excretion using a mathematical formula that was first validated by Kawasaki in 1993. So we developed and validated a widely practical method to estimate usual sodium intake in large groups of people using a morning fasting urine to estimate 24-hour excretion. And so in over 1,000 people in 11 countries on 5 continents, we measured a 24-hour urine collection and also morning fasting urine. And then we related to the 2 measures. And you could see on the left the scatter plot showing measured sodium versus estimated sodium excretion based on a morning fasting urine. You can see that there's generally good correlation and agreement between the two measures, an interclass correlation coefficient of 0.71, which is pretty good for a very simple, practical way to measure sodium using a morning fasting urine. And on the right, you see the relationship between the two measures, measured and estimated 24-hour sodium excretion versus systolic blood pressure. On the x-axis, we have different levels of sodium intake, low, medium, and high. And on the y-axis, we have systolic blood pressure. The dark circle is measured excretion. The white circle is estimated excretion of sodium. You can see with both of the measures, there's a positive association with systolic blood pressure. Furthermore, at each level of sodium, the mean systolic blood pressure using both approaches is similar. So we could use the simple practical way of measuring sodium in large groups of people to look at epidemiologic associations between sodium and blood pressure as well as clinical events. Now, for assessing individuals in a clinical setting, we would still use 24-hour urine collections. But for large groups of people in population studies to look at clinical events, we can use this simple practical method. Now, some have pointed out you can't use a single clinic measure to look at relationships between an exposure and health outcomes. And that's really a bunch of bunk because the foundation of epidemiology has been to use single clinic measures. And here's some examples, data from the Framingham study using a single systolic blood pressure measurement versus coronary heart disease, systolic blood pressure versus stroke, Copenhagen heart study, non-fasting triglycerides versus MI, cholesterol versus heart disease, and glucose versus ischemic heart disease and cardiovascular disease, all based on single clinic measures. So, and a single clinical measurement would introduce mainly random measurement error. So it would not change a straight line relationship into a U shape, for instance. And again, this has been the foundation of epidemiology. Now, we also looked at the relationship between sodium and blood pressure in a global population in PURE. Well, I'll tell you more about PURE as this presentation moves on. But here we looked at overall in 102,000 people around the world in 5 continents, we see the slope of the association where per 1 gram increase in sodium, there's about a 2.1 millimeter mercury increase in systolic pressure. That's in the overall sample. But we also see there's a lot of heterogeneity at different levels of sodium. So at higher levels of sodium, it's a steeper relationship. When you go above 5 grams per day, blood pressure goes up higher per 1 gram increment in sodium. But at moderate levels of sodium and at low levels, it's a much weaker relationship. The association becomes flatter at the low end, meaning that it's a law of diminishing returns. The more you reduce your sodium, the less of a benefit you see as far as blood pressure reduction is concerned. You get much bigger bang for your buck when you reduce average sodium intake in populations with high intake to moderate levels, but not much further benefit with sodium reduction to low levels. We also see heterogeneity by hypertension status. In hypertensive individuals, there's a stronger association. In normotensive individuals, it's much more modest, about half the magnitude of that found in hypertensives. And this is consistent with what we know from randomized controlled trials of sodium reduction, where overall we see about a 2.5 millimeter mercury increase in systolic pressure per 1 gram increase in sodium, but there's heterogeneity by hypertension status. In hypertensives, we see about a 3 millimeter mercury increase in systolic pressure per gram. In normotensives, it's about half that size, 1.5 millimeters. And this is consistent with what we find in PURE, stronger association in hypertensives. It's also important to note that most of the randomized trials were less than 6 months in duration. No randomized trial has ever been able to sustain low sodium intake at the currently recommended levels beyond 6 months. Also, it's important to note that we know from the randomized trials of blood pressure reduction using blood pressure medication that a 1 millimeter mercury difference in systolic pressure is equal to about a 2.5% change in cardiovascular risk. Therefore, based on that, we would expect that in normotensive individuals, If we were to reduce sodium intake by 1 gram, which is a lot in the population, we would only expect to reduce cardiovascular risk by about 3 to 4%. That's a very modest change in cardiovascular risk for a large reduction in sodium in the population, 1 gram. And again, this is assuming that it's only a blood pressure effect and that sodium has no other off-target effects on the body. Now, we also looked at the frequency distribution of sodium intake around the world in Pure, over 100,000 people in 18 countries on 5 continents. The red line is the distribution of sodium intake based on a single morning fasting urine. The blue line is usual intake after adjusting for random error. So you can see that overall there's about a 4.9 gram per day average in the global sample of sodium intake around the world. In the United States, we consume markedly lower than the global population average, about 3.5 to 4 grams per day, which is markedly lower than the population average globally. It's also important to note that very few people meet the 2.3 gram per day recommendation. Based on a single clinic measure, only about 3% of the global sample meets the 2.3 gram per day recommendation. And after we adjust for random error, less than 1% meets that target. For 1.5 grams per day, we see that less than 1% meet that recommendation. And when we adjust for random error, nobody meets that particular target. So in other words, what we currently recommend right now is what nobody eats. So the human experience for low levels of sodium intake is extremely sparse. Now, we also see that there are marked differences in sodium intake in China versus the rest of the world. So again, this is data from Pure. In China, over 39,000 people, average sodium intake is about 5.6 grams per day, whereas in the other countries, representing 5 continents, we see it's markedly lower, about 4.4 grams per day. Now, this is important. When you see the data on the clinical events, it's important to keep these numbers in mind, where China's level is far higher than most other countries in the world. For potassium, we don't see a China effect. Both China and other countries have a similar level of potassium, about 2 grams per day. Now, sodium is an essential nutrient. Your body needs sodium. It's not like tobacco. The body needs sodium. So it is an essential nutrient. And we know that essential nutrients tend to follow this particular relationship with health outcomes, where at high levels, you have toxicity, and at low levels, you have deficiency. And there's always a sweet spot in the middle, an optimal level in the middle associated with lower risk. And this is true for every essential nutrient, and we know sodium is an essential nutrient. And this is what we would expect for sodium versus health outcomes. So that brings us to the first of our major papers on sodium versus clinical outcomes. This is data from the OnTarget study, over 28,000 people. This is vascular disease patients in OnTarget and Transcend. Followed up for 56 months. Sodium intake was assessed using a morning fasting urine using the method I described earlier. We accrued more than 4,700 clinical events, which included mortality, stroke, MI, and heart failure during the course of the follow-up. And on the right, you see the risk curve showing the relationship between sodium and the composite outcome of major CVD and mortality. You could see that there's a sweet spot in the middle where at high levels above approximately 6 grams per day, we see an increased risk for cardiovascular events and mortality. At the low end, below 3 grams per day, we also see an increased risk. And in the middle is the optimal amount associated with the lowest risk. We see that the U.S. population average is at the lower end of the normal range associated with the lowest risk. So here we are consuming the optimal amount of sodium intake associated with the lowest risk of cardiovascular events. If we were to lower sodium in the population to what's currently recommended for this population of vascular patients, we would see an increased risk for major cardiovascular disease and mortality. Now, it's important to note that when we first saw this in 2011, we went into this analysis with no preconceptions. We were expecting to see a straight line relationship. The higher the sodium, the more clinical events, right? That's what we've been taught. And then when we saw this, we said, that's peculiar. And then we analyzed this data to death for a year and a half or 2 years, and the relationship would not go away. And then we published it in JAMA. So that brings us to the next paper. This is now data from Pure in over 100,000 people. The difference here is these are generally healthy people living in communities around the world, whereas On Target and Transcend were vascular disease patients. And we accrued more than 3,300 clinical events in 3.7 years of follow-up. Now, Pure is, again, it's a global study spanning 18 countries, low, middle, and high-income countries on 5 continents. So therefore, we capture a broad range of intake at both very low levels and very high levels. So we could assess shapes of relationships across a broad range between sodium and clinical outcomes, which has never been characterized previously, and with high precision because we have big numbers. So as I mentioned, over 100,000 people collected a morning fasting urine. About 8% of the sample had prior history of cardiovascular disease. The overall average intake was 4.9 grams per day of sodium. And as I mentioned, we had 3,300 clinical events after 3.7 years of follow-up. We took analytical approaches to address confounding and reverse causation. And here you see the risk curve showing the relationship between sodium and the various outcomes, the primary composite outcome of major cardiovascular disease and mortality, total mortality, and major cardiovascular events. And you could see that for all 3 outcomes, there's generally a similar pattern of results, a sweet spot again in the middle, high levels exceeding about 6 grams per day associated with increased risk, and low levels below about 3 grams per day also associated with increased risk. In fact, it's a steeper relationship at the low end than at the high end. And again, a sweet spot with about 3 to 6 grams per day. The population average in the US is shown by the red line, a red arrow, and you can see that we are consuming an amount that is associated with approximately the lowest risk. And if we were to reduce our intake to a lower level, you would see an increased risk of mortality or major cardiovascular disease according to these data. Now, we took a series of analyses to address confounding and reverse causality. You see here the columns showing the different sodium groups from less than 3 grams per day to greater than 7 grams per day. And the univariable model adjusting for age and sex, you could see both low and high sodium associated with increased risk. Then we did multivariable adjustment for known confounders, including demographics, socioeconomic variables like education, and lifestyle factors like physical activity, smoking, alcohol intake, and comorbidities like diabetes and statin medication use. You could see the estimates are still robust. And then when we further adjusted for dietary variables like fruit and vegetable intake and meat consumption, again, the results remain consistent. Then we conducted a series of analyses to address reverse causality. We first excluded people that had cardiovascular disease at baseline and cancer at baseline, and you could see the results again remain consistent. Then we looked at a very low risk cohort, that is people with no cardiovascular disease risk factors, and again the results remain consistent. If anything, they're amplified at the low end. And then we further excluded people that had an event in the first 12 months and the first 24 months, which is a standard approach to address reverse causality. And you could see the results again remain consistent. So no matter how you analyze the data to address confounding and reverse causation, you see the results remain robust. So Susan Opperl, who was the former head of the American Heart Association, she commented in the New England Journal, these provocative findings beg for a randomized control outcome trial to compare reduced sodium intake with usual diet. In the absence of such a trial, the results argue against reduction of dietary sodium as an isolated public health recommendation. Now, it's not just Pure showing this. Some will tell you it's just Pure. It's not true. Other studies that use 24-hour urine collection showed the same results. Here are 4 other studies. On the top left, you see this is people with type 1 diabetes, followed up for 10 years. You see, again, a J-shaped relationship where high and low sodium are associated with increased mortality. On the top right, this is type 2 diabetes patients. Here we see an inverse association where lower sodium is associated with higher mortality compared to higher sodium. In the lower left, this is healthy Europeans. There too, you see that after 8 years of follow-up, there is an increased risk of major cardiovascular disease with low sodium compared to high sodium, an inverse association. And then more recently in the Crick study published in JAMA in 2016, we see that low sodium below 2.3 grams per day is not associated with lower risk for clinical events compared to average intake, 3 to 4.5 grams per day. And there was a significant increase in myocardial infarction in the group that consumed low sodium compared to moderate sodium intake. And that study used multiple 24-hour urine collections. So as I mentioned, it's not just pure. So here's a meta-analysis by Grottel in 2016, looking at all the prospective cohort studies conducted up to now that compared usual sodium intake, about the population average here in the US, compared to low sodium. And you could see each and every time the usual sodium level wins out over low sodium. Not one single study has shown low sodium does better than average sodium in the population. Again, pure is only one of these studies. Other studies have shown similar results. So it's not just pure. Other studies show the same result. Now, high sodium compared to moderate sodium is associated with increased risk. So when you exceed, in Grottel's analysis, about 5 grams per day, like what they consume in China, then you see an increased risk. So again, a sweet spot in the middle, about 2.7 to 5 grams per day is associated with the lowest risk. Then in a more recent paper in The Lancet 2016, we looked at data from 4 studies that we pooled across and looked at 133,000 people. We had clinical events on over 10,000 individuals. And you can see there's a U-shaped relationship. Again, the middle being optimal, high and low associated with increased risk. Then we subdivided the population based on hypertensive status, both normotensives and hypertensives. You could see that irrespective of hypertension status, low sodium is associated with increased risk compared to moderate sodium. This would suggest that the potential harmful effects of low sodium are independent of blood pressure level, since they're found in both normotensives and hypertensives. At the high end, we see that there's an increased risk only in the hypertensives, whereas in the non-hypertensives is flat. This would suggest that we could target individuals who have hypertension and also consume very high levels of sodium, which, by the way, represent about 10% of the population. So rather than doing a population-wide strategy, we could focus on that 10% and get them down to moderate levels. In the same sample, we saw positive associations between sodium and blood pressure using our morning fasting urines, both in the hypertensives, shown in red, and the normotensives, shown in blue. The slope of the association was twice as steep in the hypertensives than the normotensives, which further supports the accuracy of our measurement, as this is consistent with what we find in randomized trials. And going back to the point about essential nutrients, sodium is an essential nutrient, and you would expect to see a U shape. This has been shown for other essential nutrients as well: serum 25 vitamin D, calcium, iron, selenium, marine omega-3, alpha-linolenic acid, all showing U-shaped relationships with health outcomes. Sodium, you wouldn't expect would be any different. Now, why would low sodium be harmful? We know from meta-analyses of trials that looked at other biomarkers, apart from blood pressure, showing that low sodium increases renin and aldosterone levels. And in fact, it's a marked increase and it's highly statistically significant. And we know activation of the renin-angiotensin system is vascular damaging. So we've even identified the potential mechanism to explain how low sodium may be harmful compared to average sodium. There's also an increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine, and also an increase in triglycerides as well. So to summarize, sodium intake exceeding about 5 grams per day is associated with higher cardiovascular disease and mortality. Such high levels of sodium is seen mainly in China and less common in other countries. Low sodium intake is associated with higher risk of mortality and CVD in individuals and persists after adjustment for confounders and control for reverse causality. Now, I didn't show the data for potassium in the interest of time, but we did find that potassium was protective. And it was a straight line relationship. The more potassium people consume, the lower the risk for cardiovascular events or mortality. So rather than reducing sodium, we get people to eat more potassium-rich foods like fruits and vegetables. So a population strategy for sodium reduction is appropriate only for populations with very high intakes, for instance, exceeding 5 grams per day as found in China. A targeted approach is more appropriate in other countries such as the United States and Canada. For instance, we could target those with hypertension who also consume high levels of sodium. In North America, where average intake is about 3.5 grams per day, policy of reducing sodium in everyone to below 2.3 grams per day may increase mortality. And large randomized controlled trials of low sodium below 3 grams per day versus moderate sodium 3 to 5 grams per day are essential. The World Heart Federation, in a publication in 2017, the European Heart Journal, called for randomized controlled trials to test a low sodium intake compared to average sodium intake in populations. And this was echoed in a editorial published in The Lancet in 2016 by O'Brien, and further echoed in another editorial in The Lancet, which states that before non-legislated salt reduction programs are imposed, the public should demand that the harms as well as the benefits are based solely on robust scientific evidence. Enacting potentially harmful changes without strong supportive evidence should be avoided. And then last month, a group of investigators got together from both sides of the debate and called for randomized controlled trials, one that is feasible perhaps in a prison population. So it's good that we're getting movement there. Both sides of the debate agree that trials are needed. So in medicine, we're taught first and foremost, do no harm. Public health has potential to do great good when it's right, but can do great harm when it's incorrect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I am Dr. Koichi Tamura, and thank you very much for your giving me a great opportunity to talk about ongoing our result of basic studies in our laboratory. Actually, this is Yokohama, and very good place, so please visit Yokohama. This is Mount Fuji. Okay, this button. As you know, renin-angiotensin system is a well-known system to maintain circulatory system and water and electrolyte balance in humans. So this signaling pathways may be important and beneficial. However, as you know, there's an aspect the renin-angiotensin system has because the downstream signaling pathway of AT1 receptor, on the other hand, exert pathological responses, including hypertension and cardiovascular and renal diseases. So we'd like to think that there would be a need to modulate AT1 receptor signaling in a better way. And in seeking for a new modulator of tissue angiotensin II receptor, type 1 receptor, and abbreviated as 18-1R signaling, we actually cloned 18-1 receptor associated protein, abbreviated as ATRAP, by using East-2 hybrid strategy. This ATRAP intact with carboxyl terminal region of 18-1 receptor like this. Then we got hypothesis that ATRAP may exert a functionally selective inhibition of pathological determinatory effect of AT1 receptor signaling. We'd like to inhibit this pathological signaling pathway by activating ATRAP. As you know, AT1 receptor, AT1R, is broadly expressed in many tissues of human, in normal kidneys. And as you can see here, there is a broad expression of ATRAP in the renal tubules of normal humans. And in the kidney, very high expression of ATRAP, and other tissues, there is also expression of ATRAP in normal human and normal mice or normal rats. However, it is reported that activation of cascade of intracellular AT1 receptor signaling in the kidney promotes sodium reabsorption and is involved in hypertension. As you can see here, this is glomerulus, and this is renal tubules, and this is a nephron structure in the human kidneys. And if intratubular AT1 receptor is activated, there is activation of sodium reabsorption mediated by sodium transporters. So we think that if we can activate or inhibit ATRAP expression in the kidney, we can modulate blood pressure response by modulating AT1 receptor signaling pathways. So we firstly created ATRAP knockout mice for ATRAP down in the tissues. And you can see here in the lower panel, there is no expression in ATRAP knockout mice, and there is very high expression in the normal wild type mice in the kidney. As you know, it is reported that full body knockout of angiotensinogen or renin in the mice provoked significant decrease in blood pressure and also provoked renal changes in morphology and function under baseline conditions. However, we find that genetic alteration of ATRAP in mice caused no significant change in blood pressure and kidney function and morphology, at least in the normal function, at least in the under baseline conditions. However, when we stimulated mice with pathological stimuli, such as chronic angiotensin II stimulation, as shown in this panel, there is a significant difference in the phenotypes in ATRAP knockout mice. Actually, when ATRAP knockout mice were stimulated with chronic angiotensin II infusion, there is a significant increase in blood pressure measured by telemetry in compared with wild type mice. And also, these ATRAP knockout mice exhibited cardiac hypertrophy like this, and also exhibited increase in urinary albumin excretion like here. Next, we examined the mechanistic basis of high blood pressure in ATRAP knockout mice and chronic angiotensin II infusion. And when we performed metabolic cage analysis, we noted increase in sodium retention in ATRAP knockout mice. And actually, the extent of cumulative positive sodium balance during angiotensin II infusion was significantly increased in ATRAP knockout mice as compared with wild type mice. Yeah. We further examined the mechanism of high blood pressure in ATRAP knockout mice stimulated with chronic angiotensin II. We examined expression profile of several sodium transporters in the kidney of ATRAP knockout mice and wild type mice. And we find that alpha subunit of ENaC, epithelial sodium transporters in the kidney, was highly activated by chronic angiotensin II infusion in ATRAP knockout mice. Then we performed second experiment. Actually, we got kidney-specific ATRAP transgenic mice by using conventional transgenic technology. Actually, we can see now kidney dominant overexpression of ATRAP in this transgenic mice. So we used these mice for experiment. When we checked immunohistochemistry of exogenous ATRAP expression in these ATRAP transgenic mice, we can see distal tubule dominant ATRAP expression in these transgenic mice. This is a marker for distal renal tubules, carbindin D. And when we performed laser microdissection, we can see very high expression of exogenous ATRAP and distal tubules in these ATRAP transgenic mice. So we then performed similar chronic angiotensin II infusion experiment. And in this case, as you can see here, there is a significant suppression of chronic angiotensin II stimulated blood pressure increase as compared with wild type mice. And we also performed metabolic cage analysis, and the results showed, as shown in panel B, the extent of cumulative positive sodium balance during the early phase of angiotensin II infusion was significantly decreased renal ATRAP transgenic mice. Here. And also, we performed expression profile experiment using the kidney of ATRAP transgenic mice and wild type mice. As you can see here, there is a significant inhibition of alpha ENaC expression in the kidney in ATRAP transgenic mice under chronic angiotensin II infusion. Yeah. So we got schema like this. In normal wild type mice, when mice are treated with angiotensin II, AT1 receptor is activated by angiotensin II and provoked activation of alpha ENaC expression in the kidney. So there is an increase in sodium reabsorption in the kidney to provoke hypertension in mice, or maybe in human. And in ATRAP knockout mice, there is no ATRAP, so there is a significant activation of AT1 receptor. Then activation of AT1 receptor provoked ENaC activation further to provoke further increase in blood pressure in these ATRAP knockout mice. On the other hand, in renal ATRAP transgenic mice, when these mice are treated with chronic angiotensin II infusion, there is a suppression of AT1 receptor activation by promotion of AT1 receptor internalization mediated by ATRAP. So there is a significant suppression of increase in renal sodium excretion. There is an inhibition of renal sodium reabsorption by angiotensin II. So there is a suppression of high blood pressure increase in these mice. From these results, we'd like to think that ATRAP exerts beneficial modulatory effect on renal sodium handling and blood pressure regulation in response to pathological stimuli without effect on baseline renal sodium handling and blood pressure. Therefore, ATRAP is a potential novel target of interest in salt-sensitive hypertension. And this is my final slide. As you know, this is Kyoto, very good place as well. And as a director of Japanese Hypertension Society, we'd like to invite you to participate in a hypertension meeting by Japanese Society of Hypertension and International Society of Hypertension, which will be held in Kyoto in 20 and 22. Thank you very much for your thank you very much. And sorry, and yeah. And this work was also supported by Salt Science Foundation in Japan. Thank you very much, Dr. Saito. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Welcome to the third speaker. Mr. Mortar Setten from Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Okay, I can't, I won't be able to walk around that much because it's stuck over here, the microphone. And I just want to sort of apologize if you see me walking like this. I'm the recipient of a new hip about 28 days ago, so that's why I'm walking around like this. We have a little bit of extra time, or do we? Well, it's been taken away from me. Doesn't really matter. I want to talk about low salt diets and hyponatremia, but I want to start off by saying that we have a tendency to become captive to certain narratives, and we believe in them deeply after a while without questioning them. And one of those narratives happens to be the narrative on salt. When I first joined the Salt Institute in 2005, they asked me, what about salt? And I told them, well, I thought salt was pretty bad. It causes hypertension and I was actually being very honest. They said, well, why don't you do a little bit of reading and come back and we'll talk about it more. And after doing a week of reading and all the old literature, I came back totally transformed because I realized that I too was captive of a narrative that had gone on for over a century. And if no one believes that, has anyone here ever heard of the theory of spontaneous generation? We believed in spontaneous generation for 2,000 years. Before Pasteur, actually there were a couple of towns before even Pasteur that found out that in fact life is not spontaneously generated. But we believed in it deeply. Everybody believed in it and nobody questioned it. And it's the same with salt and health. Most people believe that there's a problem with salt. Nobody really questions it. And some of the theories that have been presented are so moronic when you actually sit down and look at the actual evidence. Has anybody really looked at this carefully? And they haven't. I'm going to give you a presentation on what happens when we believe in a narrative that's false and we act upon a false narrative. Because at the end of the line, there's somebody that benefits or is harmed by these actions. And in the public health area, you have to be responsible enough to realize that your recommendations will have an impact on somebody. And here's just one example, and it's low salt diets and hyponatremia. Let's see what we can see. Now, most assisted living facilities in the United States employ low salt diets for all the people that live there. Now, I have to tell you that the day that I actually took the job and I entered the Salt Institute, there was a letter on my desk. Empty desk, one small letter. The letter was from a cardiovascular surgeon in Toronto who had retired, and his daughter had done a great favor for him and put him into a high-class assisted living facility, and where he was put immediately without question on a low-salt diet. Make a long story short, because we're on time, within 6 months, he was eating his supper at 4:30 in the afternoon, his lunch at 11:30 in the morning. He lost interest in most everything in life. Everything was tasteless. And then he started to notice that he wasn't walking as straight as he should, and then he fell and broke his hip. His hip was repaired. He started looking at the diet himself, and he told himself, I'm a well-known cardiovascular surgeon. What is wrong? And he realized that he wasn't getting enough salt in his diet. And he decided, the first thing he did was ask for a salt shaker. And he started adding salt to all his food. And he completely recovered within a year. And he wrote this story for the Reader's Digest, saying that any elderly person who's put into an assisted living facility where they automatically put you on a low-salt diet without even checking if you have any need for a low-salt diet, basically puts you into a slow, meaningless, and a heartless death. Anyway, that story was refused by Reader's Digest. It happened to be sent somehow to Mickey Alderman, who was a consultant of the Salt Institute, and somehow the copy of that came on my desk. That was my introduction to the Salt Institute. So everybody's put on a low-salt diet, and long-term low-salt diets can lead to what's called asymptomatic hyponatremia. That means for a very long period of time, you're not getting the amount of salt you should be. Now, please, I want you to, for a moment, forget the recommendations. Because recommendations are, by the way, nutritional recommendations are meaningless, because they're always a single figure. If somebody is 5'1", or if somebody is 6'7", they look at that single figure and they say, well, that's what I should be eating. In fact, that's not the case. There's no perspective given when you're given recommendations for what you should be eating. Okay, at least consumers should be told that this falls into a continuum. Somebody who weighs 120 pounds shouldn't be eating the same amount of nutrient as somebody who weighs 300 pounds. Okay, this is not rocket science. Everybody here knows that in this room. You just have to think about it for half a second. Anyway, we'll go on with this. So long-term low-salt diets lead to asymptomatic hyponatremia. And actually right now, the major dietetic associations support a stance against low-salt diets. Why? Because we have convinced them, the Salt Institute. We didn't promote salt. We didn't say anything about salt. We basically wrote letters to them saying, please read the literature. Don't accept the narrative like what we accepted for so many centuries on spontaneous generation. Okay? Read the literature, what it actually says. Don't just accept this narrative. After they read the literature, all of a sudden their stance on low-salt diets changed. This is a copy of the Schlesser letter that was left on my desk. As I said, basically he said that he found that his appetite diminished when he was put on a low-salt diet. All the negative things that happened to him when he went into this high-class assisted living facility. Okay, he broke his hip, all these things that I just mentioned before. Okay, can I read this over here? What is it, quotation? Spending your golden years in a retirement home with a low-salt diet will convert your last years to a long chronic illness. Okay? And that, of course, that article was rejected by Reader's Digest. But I never forgot it. That's actually the letter itself. Okay, let's go on over here. So what is hyponatremia? Hyponatremia is when, in fact, your normal plasma level is below what is considered the normal. When you have less sodium in your plasma than, let's say, 136, or 135 rather. Now, mild asymptomatic hyponatremia is just a little bit below that. It's not an acute disease. Severe hyponatremia is when it drops really low, and what happens is that your brain starts to swell because of normal osmosis, and you've heard of these cases where they've had to tap into somebody's skull to relieve the pressure that's been built up. That is severe hyponatremia. You don't get that in what's called asymptomatic hyponatremia. But asymptomatic hyponatremia is kind of a misnomer, because it's hyponatremia. You don't just see the very obvious symptoms, but the symptoms are there. Okay, this just goes to show some of the actions that are involved in development of hyponatremia. It permits the blood-brain barrier permits the exchange of sodium. And basically what we have really is an osmotic effect. When you don't have enough sodium, you start building up plasma in the skull area, in the brain. emergency treatment is required. This is when you have acute hyponatremia. So that's something that everybody knows. It's a very, very obvious disease, but it's not quite the same case with the next example, which is actually asymptomatic. What is actually happening? Normally when you don't get enough salt, I'll get back to one thing. Many people, as part of this moronic narrative, believe that salt goes through your body. I call it, what was it, the Vuvuzela? Do you remember those horns in the World Cup in Africa? It's like just a tube. You blow through that. Many people think that that's what happens to sodium when you consume it. It goes right through, and the next day you measure the urine, and that's it. You know exactly what somebody ate. That's not the case. I mean, that's not called metabolism. I mean, that's what a goose does when he eats things. No. I have a tendency sometimes to pick the wrong examples. But in metabolism, what really happens, and we've known this accurately since the 50s when they were doing radiolabeled studies on sodium, that the sodium that you consume in salt moves into various tissues. It moves into the skin. It moves into the bones. It moves into other tissues. They were able to do this with radioactive sodium in the salt. They were able to trace it. For 10 years they did research in this area. And it was very, very clear that the salt that you were actually measuring in the urine wasn't the salt that you ate the day before. It was the salt that came out of the tissues where it was stored initially. And you were able to do that with radiolabeled studies. If you don't get enough salt consumed on a daily basis, what happens? Well, salt starts coming out of the storage organs. Okay, it comes out of the skin, it comes out of the blood, so that you don't get hyponatremia. But if this goes on for 5 or 6 months, you start eliminating all of the stores of sodium that you have. I mean, this is not rocket science. As long as you don't believe in the Vuvuzela theory of salt metabolism, you know that you're storing salt and it's coming out and you're using it as you need it. You don't get enough for 5 or 6 months, as in an assisted living facility, you start to get symptoms of hyponatremia. And what it is, it's basically you're starving yourself of an essential nutrient. Salt is an essential nutrient. By the way, Andrew, that U-shaped curve of essential nutrients is not just for humans. It's for every essential nutrient. It's for other mammals. It's for plants. If it's essential, you don't get enough, you get sick. You get the safe range, you're healthy. You get too much, you become intoxicated. It's a U-shape for both plants and animals. If you don't get enough, you get basically a starvation of essential nutrients. Let's go through. This basically shows some of the mechanism of moving salt in and out and plasma in and out of the brain. You have all this on your USBs. Okay, so in Europe they did some studies on people living in assisted living homes. They did studies, they found some very interesting things. There's a 67% higher risk of hip fractures in assisted living than at home. In this place where you're treated like a prince, you have a much higher chance of getting hurt and damaged than you do at home, where you eat the normal diet. Their gait disturbances, I don't know if you see on the side these little sort of curbs, that's when they put people on a platform and they walk, not if they have a new hip, but they walk, and they lose their balance a little bit. That shows their gait as they are walking forward. These are actual studies. These were done in, I think, Holland. Increased risk of bone fractures on low-salt diets, osteoporosis in elderly women with borderline hyponatremia. And this just shows, as I told you, one of those platforms of what happens is you end up walking as if you were under the influence of alcohol. When you have asymptomatic, which is again a stupid name, asymptomatic hyponatremia, that's one of the symptoms. That's what happens, comparing one without hyponatremia and the one on the right with hyponatremia. More than 2 million people are living in assisted living. Most of them are on low-salt diets. 2.6 falls each year per average per person in assisted living. Broken hips. Incredible statistics for people, negative statistics for people living in assisted living under low-salt diets. I'll go through some of this quickly over here. Now, the fact is, we have convinced the nutritional associations to look into this. We didn't convince them to promote regular salt diets. We convinced them to read the literature. And they came back and they said, really, there's no basis to going ahead and having low-salt diets. Most people in assisted living should have regular diets. And they have all come out to support this. And in fact, the government has come out in support of the fact that there's no need for low-salt diets in assisted living. But everybody is captive of the narrative. So the assisted living facilities automatically put people on low-salt diets. And that's what happens when you get enmeshed in a myth and you can't erase it from your mind and start over from the beginning and say, now this is the way we have to treat our people. There are some people that do require low-salt diets, but a physician has to check them out, has to look at all the long-term impact, and then put them on low-salt diets. Not just place people on low-salt diets as if they were a bunch of lab rats. So there's enough in the literature to support regular diets for all assisted living facilities, officially, government documents, but nobody does it because, as I said, they're still captive to the old narrative. The largest dietary organizations came out in support of regular diets. A liberal approach to sodium in diets may be needed to maintain adequate nutritional status, especially in frail older adults. That was a self-portrait. Okay. Let's see if we can go any further. So where do we go from here? The goal is basically not to get into a situation that this cardiovascular surgeon Schlesser was. We have to start thinking of people in assisted living facilities as normal people and only put them on low-salt diets if their physician specifically recommends it. Or else you'll end up with your last years as a long chronic illness. And the elderly should save her life. Thank you very much.
Thank you for three speakers' presentation. And thank you for everyone. Thank you for your attention. And again, welcome to visit our booth. Thank you very much.